Welcome to the Dark Ozarks. We are discussing mirrors, specifically magic, fairy tales, and ghosts. From death customs to telling the future, mirrors have had a central place in the supernatural for thousands of years. We will get back to that in a minute, but first we want to remind you that the Dark Ozarks podcast is now available on Branson Podcast Network, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, Google Podcasts, Substack, or about any other podcast platform. So what might surprise people about that mirror hanging on their wall?
There could be a lot of things from divining the fortunes to looking into the future to trapping spirits. And yeah, we're looking at you, Bloody Mary, all the way to interdimensional travel. There have been a lot of theories through time associated with mirrors. And there are a few magic mirrors here in the Ozarks as well, if you believe the stories.
We will return to what might be behind your foggy bathroom mirror in a minute. But first, we want to invite you to like, follow, and subscribe to Dark Ozarks on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, Substack, as well as your favorite podcast platform. We also invite you to become a Dark Ozarks subscriber on Facebook. On the Dark Ozarks Facebook page, click subscribe, have your login information ready, and join Dark Ozarks behind the scenes for only $4.99 per month.
Your $4.99 per month subscription allows you to come with us on paranormal investigations, deep dive research, and topics too controversial for public view. The next 100 subscribers will be entered in a drawing for a free Dark Ozarks t-shirt and an exclusive signed first drawing copy of the book Dark Ozarks, The Spooklight. Subscribe today to be entered in the drawing.
And now you can get Dark Ozarks t-shirts for sale at darkozarks.com and paranormalsciencelab.com.
We encourage you to check out Always Buying Books in Joplin, Missouri, in person and online on Facebook and at the website alwaysbuyingbooks.com for all of your reading needs, including a large section on the paranormal, history, and more. Not to mention, the building is haunted. Tell Bob and Elise that we sent you.
We also want to thank Beard Engine Brewing Company in Alba, Missouri. Beard Engine Brewing is the only English-style brewery in Missouri and has been twice named Missouri's best brewery by the Missouri Brewers Association. Great beer and great food in a historical building with a noir past. And yes, this building is also haunted. Tell Nate and Tip that we sent you.
Absolutely. Great stuff, great people. I need more books. I would be happy to have more beer.
Yes, same. So we'll be making that happen soon, and maybe some announcements for some public events.
Excited about that. We are coming up on that season. And of course, encourage people to just be watching darkozarks.com and the Dark Ozarks Facebook page for all of that. And I'm going to be scared to brush my teeth tonight.
You know, beyond just the normal scare when you turn the light on.
Yeah. Just, I'm scary enough, all by myself. But there is something truly unsettling about mirrors once you sort of scrub away the ubiquitousness of mirrors in our daily lives.
That's true. And, you know, it is kind of interesting because lore around mirrors goes back thousands of years worldwide, but it kind of breaks down two ways of how it developed, particularly in ancient times. The West was more creeped out by mirrors overall, I'd say, than the East. And you can see in the lore that developed, even in the Near East, going back to the ancient Egyptians, there really was not this negative or fearful side so much. In fact, mirrors were a means of communicating with the gods. And my guess is the ancient Egyptians would be a little perplexed at some of our phobias about about death and mirrors and so forth. And then in the Far East, in China and Japan in particular, magic mirrors had a completely different connotation of what magic was than developed in the West.
They did. They really did. And I found that very fascinating. There is actually an extraordinarily rare Asian magic mirror, apparently in the Fine Arts Collection in Cincinnati.
Yes. And basically, I mean, they were works of art. Not many survived, but basically they were metal and with light shown on them, they become translucent, and etchings on them are then reflected onto a white wall or surface. Much like magic lanterns became in the 18th and 19th century in the West, where basically you would have an image backlit by a candle or whatever that was projected by a lens onto a wall. But they were doing this with metal thousands of years ago.
Yes, we're talking about a bronze discs that it is really fascinating. From what we can tell, they in terms of the craftsmanship, we're really not sure how they made them. We just know that they made them.
And we know that because a few do still exist, but the craftsmanship would have to be amazing for this to happen, because the symbols and the images that would be cast were not visible by the naked eye.
No, it was only when you were actually using the mirror with a very strong light source that it would reflect the patterns. And from apparently what we can tell, the magic mirror in the Cincinnati Art Museum does date to the 15th or 16th centuries, but the records are that this type of mirror was first created in China during the Han Dynasty, which is 200 BC to 200 approximately AD.
Right. So, and it may be a little different conception of the idea of magic, of what we're used to discussing on Dark Ozarks or in the West generally, but I could certainly see why they refer to them as magic mirrors, because
Right.
there would be no apparent means of eliciting these images.
Very, very true. And based on what seems to be projected from the mirrors, the mirrors appear to have been created for religious significance, and that I think is an important aspect. These had great supernatural significance, or at least directed toward a supernatural focus, a religious focus, a faith focus. Which, albeit not necessarily paranormal, is still significant within the realm that we're talking about, oftentimes with Dark Ozarks. And for an Ozarks connection, there's a pretty strong indicator, certainly a potential existent rumor, that a Chinese army may have marched through the Ozarks all the way to the St. Louis area.
In the 1400s, yes, that is true. Might have had a disc with them, but another interesting opposition to the West is that now often mirrors are placed in temples, in Buddhist temples and Shinto temples, both as protective devices and to repel ghosts and evil spirits. And also in Japan, often viewed with this purpose in the homes. Whereas in the West, we worry about things being trapped in the mirrors and what could get through them instead of protecting us from those things.
It is an interesting point of comparison, and of course, mirrors figure heavily in feng shui, and again, just the placement in general for utilizing the movement of energy, repelling negative energy, moving positive energy within a space. As it's not that dissimilar to me to, for example, having winding paths leading to the door instead of straight ones, or putting a bottle tree next to the path to the front door.
Very, very true. And if we also look at the history of witch balls in the West, which, witch balls were used to repel witches or the evil eye. And if you have a witch ball that has spun glass inside it, they are said to trap evil spirits or evil witches. I have several in my house, in fact. I don't know if you've ever noticed. Yeah, there's several hanging in the dining room.
Yes. Which is, now, what do you think? Because obviously, with aspects of the West, there are negative connotations with mirrors in the West, as well as just a lot of lore. What do you think in terms of the more negative lore that we've grown up with here in Western civilization?
One, that you could lose your soul into a mirror. And that can happen in several ways. The other is that there can be things on the other side of the mirror, whether it be in, the other world, beyond the veil, or another dimension, that could find their way through and cause you harm. I think those are probably the two things, and they both are premised on the fact that the mirror is permeable. It is a surface that can be traveled through or across.
Right. And so what we're really doing is that we're looking at the mirror as a doorway into into a world we don't know.
Right. And that could have consequences of death, loss of your soul, or eternal entrapment.
Yes.
Or letting loose the beasties that could wreak havoc.
Yes. And I do find it interesting. So as with a lot of magical lore, the advice that you get is often contradictory. Very head-to-head contradictory. So in some cases, obviously we all know that breaking a mirror is 7 years bad luck. So that is just an understanding in our culture. You don't have to explain its provenance. We just know that's part of good luck versus bad luck.
But often people don't know why is it 7 years?
Yes. And the other thing that I think is interesting is that in some cases, breaking the glass might open the portal. In other, also Western lore, breaking the glass might close the portal.
That's true. And I guess, to be perfectly honest, you never really know in one given situation which way that's going to work. So it's kind of like the movie scene when someone's disarming the bomb and they have to pick between the two wires and they're not sure, and it's 50-50. And so sometimes it kind of works that way with breaking a mirror in these situations.
So if you are ever presented with a cursed mirror and you don't know whether to keep it in one piece or break it, just check your watch and see how much longer your movie is.
That's true. You'll find out.
If you're, yeah, it just depends on which act you're in. But other than that,
But before I forget, some people may be wondering, why 7 years? And I remember, younger years going, why 7? And I've heard people say, well, seven is just, it's a, a number surrounding luck. But the lore actually is a little deeper, that supposedly that it takes 7 years for a soul to migrate if it's lost.
So is this based on the idea that there's a soul trapped in the mirror and that breaking it releases it into the ether?
Well, that breaking it actually can cause you to lose your soul.
Gotcha.
So and in which case, some of the lore says bury the pieces and don't ever look at the pieces, because that's how you can lose your soul into a broken mirror. But if all else fails, to grind it up to basically dust.
Yes.
So I'm not sure, again, it's, do I bury it or do I grind it up?
And I think that
grind it up and bury it.
even with the idea, with the lore, the protective lore around it, around the mirror, it is perhaps significant that there is duality within that there is constant contradiction, even in what to do, in case of fire, break glass. No way, don't. That
especially if the fire's on the other side of the veil.
yes, you just keep that there. And the idea, which we're going to get into some individual experiences that begin to move this out of the realm of theory and into actually contemplation, as far as investigation or occurrence. But the idea that it's at point of death, you make sure that the mirrors are covered, because the person's soul could be trapped in them after it exits the body at point of death.
Yes, that basically they see the mirror, get confused, and go into it, and can be trapped. And so, and then usually the lore is that this is a risk until they're buried, which I find is a bit of a conundrum, because the idea that is the soul separate from the body, but once it's buried, it's okay.
Right. And I think obviously the idea is something that is a bit more, that is probably a bit old-fashioned for most of us, but the idea of resting in peace in a consecrated graveyard.
Likely that's probably where that comes from. But then again, there's stories of haunted graveyards that go back hundreds of years. So
yes, or at least if they're going to haunt something, they're not going to be stuck in your mirror. They're going to be at the graveyard where they can be contained.
Well, they're pre-contained in the mirror, but you just have to
Yeah,
look at them while you're brushing your teeth.
exactly. You don't want to do that. So you put them in the graveyard. The consecrated graveyard, I'm totally riffing here. And this is again, once you're dealing with investigation and once you're dealing with lore, you really have to separate yourself from the very concrete logical and rational physics that we're accustomed to dealing with,
Oh yeah,
because you once you begin interacting with the spiritual realm or realms, the rules of physics don't apply, therefore our rules of logic don't necessarily apply, and so you do have to take these
exactly.
things on a case by case basis. In so many cases there seems to be nothing about a graveyard or mirror that is tethering or trapping or keeping or enticing a spirit to stay within that location. And so, for us as investigators, for example, with cemeteries, it's bad luck to go to a cemetery at night. It's spooky to go to a cemetery at night. Oh my gosh, you'd never be at the cemetery at the stroke of midnight. You'd never be at a cemetery during the witching hour, these types of things. And we do that on a regular basis. It's not creepy. It's oftentimes very beautiful, very peaceful. Even when there is paranormal activity, it can be
Oh
very,
yeah.
very, very positive experience. And that's something that I think a lot of would-be ghost hunters or people who are excited about it or allured by it would be scratching their heads, that interacting with the dead can be a very peaceful, beautiful, and enriching experience. And there's, in the vast majority of cases, there's nothing to be creeped out about. And at the same time, I think it's very important for us as investigators and folklorists and historians to approach those rare instances when the dogmatic lore somehow applies. And because
True.
that happens too, it doesn't happen across the board, but then it can happen according to the lore, or in accordance with the lore.
That's true, and that brings to mind one piece of lore that fits into all of this because it has to do with the soul. Is that we all know that in the vampire movie or the werewolf movie that they have no reflection, and the reason they have no reflection in mirrors because they're at this point have no soul, or the werewolf would have a soul in human form but theoretically not in werewolf form. And then there's lore that basically goes the same for demons, that a demon does not have a reflection in the mirror, although he could be trapped in the mirror and you could see him, but that's
But
another
that's not a
that's
reflection.
that's another algebra problem.
X and Y are not, anyway.
But so much of this is tied up into the interaction and relationship between between a soul and a mirror.
Yes.
And that is also why there are devices that basically came out of the Middle Ages and during the witch hunts. They're called witch boxes, and basically, and they can be employed in investigations as well. I've used them before. Basically, a box made out of mirrors, all facing inside. The idea is that spirit is trapped in the box. And technique that can be used, and I've used before, is actually you have the mirrored box and it's sealed on all sides, and you have an audio recorder in it inside the box while you do a EVP session. It's a little bit different play, sort of on the Estes method that's so big right now. But it goes back to the idea that in the Middle Ages, during witch hunts, that you could trap a witch's soul in the witch box with the mirrors.
Interesting. In terms of the investigation with paranormal investigations, what are your thoughts about using a witch box?
I don't know that it really does anything one way or another, that you get any more results. We would use it and then have separate recorders in the same room. And the idea comparing, do you get different responses inside the box or more clear responses? And really didn't get any significant evidence indicating one way or the other. And that's probably why I haven't done it in quite a while. However, I do think that you could probably experiment with something along those lines, and then with magnets and electricity, that you might get something more.
Very, very true. It's just as we're talking, it reminds me, growing up, there was one family member's bathroom that had opposing sinks. It was like a galley.
Yes.
Space.
The what do they call it? It's not the eternal. Oh, what I just, the phrase just left my brain. Where it's an eternal mirror image.
Yes, very.
You're not supposed to stand between them.
And when you have to walk between them to get to the toilet, it's a little difficult. And I don't think the designer thought about that.
It's interesting obstacle course. How bad do I have to go to the bathroom?
Because I was about 9 at the time. Had I known the lore, I guarantee you I'd have been on my hands and knees crawling under the sinks, between the sinks, to go to the bathroom.
Yeah.
But it really, I think that's interesting. I found it fascinating. For the record, I did look at myself in that space. I would actually goof off because you poke your head in and look one way and you'd see like your head into infinity.
Yes.
It was quite entertaining. However, that could mean that that my soul has actually been splintered into infinity, and there's we released an infinite number of 9-year-old Joshes into the interdimensional plane, which actually could explain a lot of what's wrong with everything at this point. All because I had to go to pee. That's the truth. I just had to pee.
I wasn't going to say, but it might actually explain a few things.
It really does. It really does. It explains. Yeah, it does. I won't argue with that.
Now the flip side is, and I forget the name of the pandemonium room. Basically, I can't remember the name of it. Which is a room that is all mirrored, and now in Eastern traditions, it is a good thing. It is often used to do yoga in and to focus the mind. So again, it's a situation where the same thing is viewed very differently in the East versus the West.
It is. It is. It does remind me of something that I'll probably get strung up by my toes on, but there's at least an infinite number of Joshes running around in ultimate other universes, I suppose. So it doesn't matter. But as someone who is a longtime yoga practitioner, I've done yoga for a long time. Yoga is a really good way to come face to face with your subconscious.
Yes.
Especially in the meditation portions, and I know that because I've done it, and I have done a lot of that practice, and there are times that coming face to face with your subconscious can be very unsettling, especially if we're very repressed over particular emotions at particular times. And I have a strong opinion on this, that individuals who have a negative opinion about yoga and the idea that it's somehow demonic, etc. And I've heard those arguments, and I respect those positions, but in so many cases where we're not meeting something dark, we're meeting our subconscious, and it's scaring the hell out of us.
Yes, and for those that are that scared of it, there, for me, I'd be more concerned of why you're so scared of facing yourself than
Yes. And I think.
Oh, I was just gonna say, ironically, I find you hear that more these days than you used to. I remember when I started hearing that argument, I thought, what? It doesn't make much sense if you have practiced yoga. But that's just me.
And I've practiced yoga a lot. It's something that I find very, very effective, very important. And for those of us who do it, it's a very powerful and beautiful expression. But you do you do come face to face with your more darker sides. I think the big issue is that if you don't realize, and this is easy enough to have this happen if you're not schooled in the process, if you don't have the awareness, you can encounter things within this, within the meditation, within the processes that are scary, and you don't realize that it's something that is a part of yourself that you have to work through. In the same sense that most nightmares are simply our subconscious trying to get our attention about something, and we're too busy to listen.
Exactly. And I mean, and this, the same goes for different aspects of paranormal investigation as well. I think that, sometimes when people have a negative experience, it's often because of their own fears, their own emotions and mental state, and not as far as mental health, but just, are you in a good state of mind at the time?
Yes.
That leads to these situations that then people have a very strong reaction against, and feel that it's very negative, where and they project that onto the environment or the spirit or entity involved. Whereas a lot of times it's more the living person that is the catalyst for what's going on.
Oftentimes it is, and all of this is happening on an energetic level that doesn't involve, or doesn't necessarily involve, verbal communication.
Very true, very true. And most people are not adept or experienced at that kind of communication, that kind of sensory perception. And so when suddenly it happens, I find that people either have a sort of that almost a fight or flight dichotomy. Either they accept it and accept that they are a part of this exchange of energy, or it's, oh, whatever that is, it's bad.
Yes, I think this is was I didn't really know this is where we're going to go, but I think this is really important not only to mirrors
Right.
and mirror, but also just in terms of paranormal investigations as a whole, or finding yourself perhaps inadvertently, as I am wont to do, inadvertently in spaces that have a lot of activity, and it's for people who are, for example, freaked out about the yoga aspect because of its Eastern religion aspects. Bringing it back to something that has no religious connotation to it whatsoever, for me, which is how I typically center myself before going into an investigation, is coming back to the space as though I were walking into a stable full of horses.
Okay.
Because horses communicate via more on an energetic level. Obviously, it's nonverbal communication. We do know that they have a very sophisticated communication process, and they react to energy. If you've ever ridden a horse, you know that they're going to react. Or you if you're going to get on a horse, you need to understand that they're going to read your energy and take cues from you or react badly from you. One of the two. And so moving yourself into a centered place where you're simply existing, observing, and not pushing is really crucial in terms of interacting with horses. So, for example, if I'm getting ready to, and I love animals, but I love big animals, and so I don't have a problem, for example, walking into a corral full of horses, but I need to make sure that I'm doing it the right way.
Exactly. Well, I mean, and honestly, that comes with being around large animals in general. I mean, it's something you learn growing up with them. I grew up on a ranch, and so, and I think that often people forget. I mean, people react on an energetic level.
We do.
We all do. A lot of people don't recognize that or make that connection, but we do. And if you walk into any situation, whether it's investigating or a group, a room full of people, in a lot of ways, it's the same skill set. And it is important to recognize that you are part of that process, if nothing else, because of your reactions, and by just divorcing yourself as an actor in the process, it's sort of like cutting your nose off to spite your face.
It is, and it's something that we see a lot with this sort of postmodern superficiality, sort of the plastic society approach that I think many of us in the West, and many of us in North America in particular, and in the United States in specific, are really that we're inured within, we're inculcated within this process, and the mistaken belief structure is that we as an individual I am somehow above, separate, and not part of the world around me.
Yes, that's a good way of putting it.
It's the idea that we're essentially othering everything. That might be the other people in the banquet. It might be the other, for example, interacting with animals as though there's some sort of other, as opposed to where we're sharing energy on a one-on-one basis. And then it really becomes the other when it's the paranormal.
Very much so. Which it is a large part of, we mentioned witchcraft and witches earlier, which is a large part of what is magic, what is witchcraft. The whole idea is people who can do something.
Yes.
Affect the environment. And often in our postmodern society, we say, oh, that can't be done. And it's just written off. But affecting the environment, affecting the energies in a room on a fundamental level is exactly that.
It is. It is. And it takes on many forms. And because again, we're dealing with an energetic tool set. These tools can be used for a wide variety of reasons. And it also depends on the perspective of the person employing the tools, or the perspective of the person who is the beneficiary of the results of the tools, to decide whether or not that's good or bad.
That's true. And it makes me kind of coming full circle a little bit in the discussion, makes me think a little bit about some of the ancient uses of mirrors, and most people think of mirrors as a glass object, but basically a very shiny object, whether it's metal, it could even be stone or whatever. Goes back to the ancient Egyptians in the use of mirrors to travel basically to the other world and back. And the process that they believe that mirrors play in that is very much what in the 21st century people would call astral projection.
Yes. Yes. And to me, that is both fascinating, and it might actually be laying the groundwork for things trapped in mirrors, or the idea that a part of you goes someplace else and can't find its way back.
True. But the conception that they used was that basically through the use of the technique with the mirrors, that you would be temporarily detached from your body.
Yes.
Trap. And they didn't really seem to have the concept of being trapped in the mirror, that it was more just a tool to use. It's kind of like getting in your car.
And something that seems to be consistently implied with the study of the ancient world is that the ancient world may not necessarily have had, our technology, but that they had a highly sophisticated understanding of, for example, what we're talking about, these energetic processes, or a better understanding of what we would call the subconscious or the astral plane, these types of things that in so many cases that we here in the West are barely discovering, or we have an infantile knowledge of, if we have any knowledge of it at all. And one possibility, I'm just throwing this out here, I have no idea what I'm talking about, I'm just spitballing, but certainly with the fall, the monolithic weight of the Roman Empire, which seemed to place a lot more emphasis on governance and military than it did on inner journey.
Mm-hmm.
And then from there, the collapse of the empire and the loss of so much ancient knowledge that the remnants of that could be as simple as knowing that, for example, sending the soul onto a journey into another plane is possible with the mirror, but you might not have the tools intuitively to bring it back.
I kind of, I can see that. It also might kind of explain sort of that divergence, continued divergence between East and West, because they did not have the same break in technology, in law, sort of setbacks in education and knowledge that the West did, and knowledge that, quote, was lost in the West still existed for the most part, most of it that we know of, but existed in the East, in the Near East, in parts of Africa. But that break, as you just described with Rome and the consequences, that could explain a lot of that divergence and why perhaps so much fear along with it, whereas other parts of the world that didn't go through that tumultuous decline and have more continuity seem to view these things in a more positive light.
That the knowledge of the tool set, the knowledge that these sorts of things are possible existed, but the precise means of doing it safely or effectively might have been lost in the process. Mm-hmm. And I mean, that would be analogous to having a car to drive, but not knowing how.
Basically, you've lost the key.
Yeah. Or you've lost the memory of how to do it, but it still runs, which is actually terrifying.
That's it's a central crisis in the making
there. As you drive over a cliff. And it is, I think that there is also an innate dichotomy. I think that there's a physical dichotomy in terms of knowledge retained and knowledge lost, and with that mm-hmm. comes familiarity or fear. But I think that there is a natural dichotomy that once you begin potentially interacting with these other realms, that some things are very positive and some things can smack back. And part of the ancient knowledge would presumably have involved being able to tell the difference. But if we're bereft of that knowledge, then all of it could be potentially dangerous as an idea.
That is true. Now here's a crutch here. Tell me what you think. For instance, in voodoo, mirrors are often kept in the kitchen, which, in the West we tend not to do that, but they keep mirrors in the kitchen so that ghosts can consume food that is reflected in the mirror.
Yes.
I
think that's a beautiful
satisfying them and appeasing them, I would assume.
Yeah.
So where do you think that comes into play? Of course, you have the coming together of European traditions and African traditions in that. So where would you say that fits in with your missing knowledge? Or
well, I do think that it certainly hints at something very tantalizing, which is the possibility that the the West African, particularly the Benin religion or animism culture, which is oftentimes regarded as sort of a primitive or backwoods uh, belief structure, very far away from the more quote unquote enlightened ancient religions. For example, Egypt or China or the Indian subcontinent, so on and so forth. That it might not be that you know our traditions that are coming from West Africa might actually be vastly more sophisticated and deep into this sort of subconscious archetypal lore that exists. I think that's really fascinating. I also think that it really speaks to uh, the in many cases the warmth and the bonds that are implied from not only West African culture, but it reminds me of similarities of Mayan culture and Latin American pre-Catholic culture that is reflected in Dia de los Muertos, the idea that the dead are simply our family members that we're still communing with, we're still talking to, in some cases we're still feeding, we're still making sure that they're okay. And that begins a transition, to me, a really beautiful transition. When I read that, I actually made me want to go find a mirror and then cook some food. And in the idea that from a very beautiful and I would say earthy or connective or emotionally warm place, the idea that you're not appeasing the spirits as much as you're making sure that your family is fed.
Yes, yes, and I do really like that. And to throw a monkey wrench into that, or something, take a sharp left turn. Then there was the conception of the Aztecs that mirrors basically were a symbol of war.
Right. And
duality.
Duality. But I don't think that's a monkey wrench. I think that one of the commonality that we're seeing with all of the lore is it is this and that simultaneously. It's a Janus fairy. It, and I was wanted to throw this in really quickly, and I think it does say in, and we'll come back to the Aztecs and then John Dee. But the idea that, so I think I've done an effective job of mounting the argument that so much of this lore is not scary, it's not spooky, that there does seem to be an ancient tradition that is associating the paranormal with supernatural, and with the idea of the mirror as a portal or a conduit of some sort involving energy. These types of things that seems to resonate with our minds or our spirits, even if it doesn't make sense to our rational mind. All of these things, and that the scary parts are just us interacting with our subconscious, so on and so forth. All that to be said, there is one bit of lore, which is the idea that a mirror beside your bed can steal your soul, or that something can come through. And for the record, I will not have a mirror in my bedroom. I will not have a mirror next to my bed. And if I am someplace that a mirror is in that situation, I'm going to cover it because I'm not dealing with that.
And we'll tell the story behind that.
Yes, personal experience. Because there are, and this is again, I think it speaks to the duality. There's the very beautiful aspects of this portal concept, and there are very comforting aspects to the supernatural, the paranormal concepts. There's very peaceful aspects to it. There are aspects that we simply need to understand our subconscious. There are also, anytime that you are dealing with portals, we are also dealing with the potential of things that may be predatory and or ominous that are outside of our subconscious. This is not just a reflection of our subconscious. There may be something else that is there.
That's true. And that the question mark in all that, I think, is what is both tantalizing and often creates fear in people.
It does. It does. And certainly a foundation to what is consistently one of the creepiest or the cheapest jump scares in a horror movie, which is something reflected behind you in the mirror.
That's true. That's true. And there are a few places that those kind of things actually do happen with mirrors. People see things. And it does remind me, you saying that, it reminds me again of the movie Prince of Darkness, where the mirror is the main focal point of as a barrier and a doorway to the netherworld, that the devil or demon is held from this world on the other side, and that that barrier that we take for granted in a lot of ways, that this world and that world are separate, very much plays on that, including to the point of, shriveled, clawed fingers coming through the surface of the mirror. And then ultimately, apparently being a means of time travel.
Yes. And jumping back really quickly to the Aztecs, the idea that the mirror was representative of both fire and water, which I found, again, we do keep coming back to this symbol of duality. It comes back to duality, but duality that as you break it apart and put it back together, it makes sense. The mirror is reflective. It's like reflective water. The Celts considered the mirror image of a pool of water, a bog, a pond, to be a liminal space and an opening into the underworld. It appears that the Aztecs were perhaps channeling the same similarities of idea. In this case, the mirror is representative of water, as well as the elemental, subconscious, and magical properties of water. At the same time, a mirror can be used to focus sunlight to create fire, which is also associated with war.
And a lot of their mirrors were made from obsidian, which is basically volcanic glass, which I'm sure they realized made an association of the glass coming from the volcanoes and fire. So you have this obsidian that is born of fire,
yes,
reflects fire, focuses light into fire, but shimmers like the surface of water.
Yes, which is really, it is beautiful. I love this because it's really forcing, it's an unboxing. It's forcing us to, meme reference. It is forcing the mind to get outside of it's this or it's that.
Right. And that sense of duality is probably good segue into discussing John Dee. Aside
I
from the fact that he used an Aztec mirror to scry.
He did, and John Dee is one of our heroes. I think it's fair to say.
Yeah.
He was born in 1527 and died in 1608 or 9. He actually died. We don't know when he died, and we don't know where he's buried.
No, because he had a falling out with the king after he saved him.
Yes.
James had that habit.
I get that. Oh, and John Dee, for people who are unfamiliar, was an English polymath. He was court astronomer and astrologer and advisor to Queen Elizabeth I. And his resume included, but was not limited to, mathematician, astronomer, astrologer, teacher, occultist, and alchemist.
Yes.
And
by some accounts, witch hunter.
Yes, and by other accounts, a witch.
Yes, so again, it kind of just depends on which side you're on. How you view him.
It really, really does. I am fascinated by the fact that his gravesite is unknown.
It's very fitting for him in some ways.
Dismayed and fascinated. I was also very pleased in doing, some additional research for the episode to realize that the John Dee was of Welsh ancestry.
Yes.
Not surprised about that, and very excited as well for personal reasons. And John Dee is, as far as I'm concerned, as close as you can get to the archetypal magician wizard in our current historical narrative.
I think that is very fair to say. And it's in some ways it's perplexing that he's not as well known as some others, such as Nostradamus, who we will mention in a moment as well. But he served Elizabeth I using his occultist powers very successfully. Then went on his basically sabbatical, and to consternation of Elizabeth as well as other regents in Europe, who either viewed him with open arms or suspiciously as a spy. Then came back. A bit of a rocky relationship with Elizabeth after that, but did serve James. And if stories are to be believed, that through use of his obsidian mirror was able to reveal the gunpowder plot.
Interesting. And this obsidian mirror is believed, and pretty securely believed, to have been of Aztec origin.
Yes, they've determined that through scientific examination that the obsidian came from a particular volcano that I think is about 30 or 35 miles from Mexico City.
Yes.
So it made its way back with the Spanish, and he procured it. And I think it sits in one of a museum in London, I believe, doesn't it?
Quite possibly. I'm not 100% sure, but I believe it is on display. And I'm just curious as to what John Dee did to procure it. I think that could be a story in and of itself.
I've read a couple of articles previously that basically there's some conjecture that he procured it through a particular conquistador, but they really don't know. They're really kind of perplexed how he ended up in England, um, but that that his divination using it as screen was very successful and accurate as those things went.
So coming into that and just digging into scrying as a subject, because the mirrors, there's a number of things that are used for scrying, but mirrors are certainly a dominant tool.
Mm-hmm.
And the question is, how does someone scry?
Well, to be in some ways, you can sort of equate it to the discussion earlier with yoga and confronting the unknown versus the unconscious in yoga. That things are revealed, and from a purely objective scientific basis, you would say it's pareidolia, it's just manifestations of the subconscious, etc., that you're seeing, either tricks of light in the mirror, or say Nostradamus, with all of his predictions, he used a dark bowl, and I can't remember, I think was metal, but I may be wrong, with water, and he would see images in the water. And this is very much the same idea as crystal balls, as people, have seen them used by, fortune tellers, etc. It's the same concept.
And I think it's one of the things that I'm a little sad that we essentially lost, beginning with James the First, and then continued to lose as we moved into the Cromwell era. That
Oh, Oliver.
I know. Oh, no more Christmas. Is that prior to James the First, we certainly, I think it would be reasonable to say that Elizabeth was really at the pinnacle of this brave new world, in which these types of arts, and I would classify it as an art more than a science, but that these types of arts were recognized, were held in comparatively high esteem. It was not, something that was looked askance at. Obviously, if memory serves, John Dee was utilized astrology to choose Elizabeth's coronation date for her for an auspicious day.
Yes.
And then we see how well that worked out. One of the most successful monarchs in all of English history. And at the same time, this is Queen Elizabeth was not someone that we think of as flighty or superstitious or capricious in off on flights of fancy and following crazy ideas. Here was a woman who was extremely grounded in her leadership. She was grounded in the military and the economic needs of her burgeoning empire, and at the same time very comfortable with a favorite court astrologer. And with James, beginning with James and then continuing on into the Civil War / Puritan Wars, etc., we just began this monumental shift away from that mindset that it could be both. You could be a perfectly grounded, rational leader who also, without contradiction, embraces these arts that less sense to someone who is not skilled in them.
Very true. I think that it's a matter that my guess is just she viewed it as one more set of tools.
And one that seems, as with some of these situations, some of the my understanding is that she would consult John Dee in terms of potential assassination attempts on her, of which there were many.
Yes.
Etc. And presumably she was doing so because he had a good track record.
I would assume, and I mean, obviously she had a very long reign that was not ended by violence. So, I think that, astutely she was looking at probably the advice from on all fronts, and then making that decision of what made sense based on all the information. And again, John Dee is a little more complicated than being an astrologer. He was so gifted and skilled in so many areas that I would assume that he came at things with all of those disciplines at once, which most people don't do, granted, that probably ended up with a more balanced sense than we would normally give credit to when we hear the word astrology.
I think that is extremely fair, and something that is, to me, really fascinating about the aspect of the fusion between science and art. And we typically, in our very modern world, or postmodern world now, we separate those two into very far apart boxes. And
I think that's fair.
Our cultural mind. And I think that does a disservice to both. You look at the alchemical roots of individuals like Isaac Newton. You look at the scientific roots of individuals like John Dee, and you see that there is a fusion as we're coming into the early modern era in England, and as England is becoming the British Empire, which is apparently or allegedly a term coined by John Dee, the British Empire, is a beautiful fusion of science, rationality, and the esoteric arts that we don't really hold particular space for at this time.
No, and really, when you think about it, I mean, to be perfectly honest, in a lot of ways, there's not a lot of difference between John Dee and Isaac Newton as far as their interests and the things that they researched. Very similar. The most notable difference is that Dee ended up holding the position of court astrologer, whereas Newton was at university, but they both were pursuing, alchemy and these esoteric arts as well as science.
They were, which is something that in the cursory reviews and our cursory understanding, sort of our grade school understanding of Sir Isaac Newton, it's usually left out of the process. We've got Isaac inventing calculus and having a figurative or perhaps literal apple drop on his head to give us the law of gravity, and that's usually about as far as it goes. So,
right.
Digging into these these esoteric arts is, I think on an initial review can be very unsettling for individuals who aren't prepared for their hyper rational scientific heroes to be meddling around in this kind of stuff. But it wasn't by accident.
Very true. Very true. I want to switch gears a little bit and kind of do compare and contrast with D with Nostradamus.
I think is fascinating. And Nostradamus is a household name, but most people don't know a lot about what it was he was actually doing.
True, and again, he in a lot of ways he fits into the same box with Newton and Dee. He was a physician, so he was a man of medicine at the time, as medicine was at the time. He actually treated plague victims, but he would use the divining arts through mirrors and water. And he hid this pretty much because it could get you killed. But he did, similar to Dee, he did end up in the favor of the queen, because his reputation did get around, even though he was trying not to get afoul with the law and the crown. And he made a prediction of how, or what could be interpreted as a prediction of how the king would die. And King Henry died jousting with a splinter through the eye. And of course, anyone familiar with the quatrains of Nostradamus, they are poetic, vague in a lot of ways, and certainly open to interpretation. But that one is interesting because while a lot of them people will say he predicted this 400 years in the future, 500 years, this was something that happened in his lifetime, and it certainly caught the attention of the queen. And then it tended to bear itself out. But he was still very careful to not portray himself as actually predicting the future, because he didn't want to run afoul of the church, etc. either. And that's why we do have his writings that are so vague. And now people say, oh, he predicted 9/11, he predicted this, he predicted that, which you read them and it's like, it could be this or it could be that. It could describe a lot of things that have happened. But in essence, he had a very similar, if not personality, career path as Dee. But I think the reason that he is so well known now is just because he wrote down the quatrains.
I think that's very fair. And my general understanding is probably mid 80s, late 80s, there started to be sort of semi-historical documentaries with a bit of a lean toward the gratuitous in terms of exciting the imagination about Nostradamus, about his predictions, about the fact that here's a character, a personality from the Renaissance who has these predictions that are speaking to us about something today, and
Yeah.
the almost salacious nature of magical voyeurism, in that sense, that it's, getting you to watch the Mountain Dew commercial to get to the next part where Nostradamus is going to reveal your future as well. And
And I think that is the romanticism of it, is that if he was accurate, even with just a percentage of his quatrains, then it might be possible that we all might divine our future if we
yeah,
are so inclined.
and that's both exciting and frightening, I think, because, and again, coming back to the mirrors, and then the association with scrying, we're looking at mirrors utilized for divining the future, to looking into the future and saying what's going to happen. And that is something that is extraordinarily enticing, equal parts frightening.
It is. I'm curious your thought on this. How would you view scrying as with mirrors or mirror-like surfaces, all included, versus other divination that is still done, say tea leaves and things like that, chicken bones, things like that?
It is interesting, and I don't have a good answer in that regard. The commonality that is I think both wise and confounding simultaneously is that if you yourself happen to be unfamiliar with the practice, and most of us are unfamiliar with the practice, we could have two people in front of us using any of the potential methods.
Mm-hmm.
Scrying mirror, crystal ball, etc., that we are the chicken bones. It doesn't really matter, and one person could be doing it correctly, and another person could just be making stuff up, and we on the outside wouldn't necessarily be able to tell the difference.
I mean, that's true. I wonder if there's something more unique with a mirrored surface that interacts with our subconscious.
That, I think, is fair. I think, again, it is associated with that sense of portal, that sense of a window into another world. And there are aspects of mirror work that are hard to duplicate in other forms of divination. Your tea leaves, your chicken bones, your a wide variety of divination tools. It's not a reflective or immersive portal.
That's true. The sense of three dimension, I think, has an effect on the brain and perhaps intuitive powers. I'm not sure.
Mm-hmm. And there's the aspects of potential connection with the subconscious, which is extraordinary. But then there is that next step, which is you may become connecting with something that's no longer internal.
That's true. And I mean, as soon as you make the leap that you are interacting with even the fates to see the future, you open that possibility that it's something else that you have no control over and may have its own intelligence and free will.
It reminds me of the moment with the Palantir. in Fellowship of the Ring, they're
Yeah.
not all accounted for. We don't know who may be watching.
Exactly. Exactly. And it's certainly a practice that has made its way into the modern New Age and Wiccan communities.
Yes, it absolutely has. For with a variety of reactions and responses. I think that there is something innately engaging. There's something archetypal about the work
Right.
that we recognize it, and we don't just recognize it. Doesn't just resonate um, because we watched Wizard of Oz. But I think that when the early audiences, the original audiences, watched Wizard of Oz, that those moments resonated on an archetypal level as well. The idea that there are powers, there are um, esoteric arts, there are ways of doing things or affecting the world around us, or seeing things that could not otherwise be seen, and that this is part of the human story, albeit one that has largely been lost in modernity. And so we resort to fiction and dramatization and novelization to explore these things, because it's very difficult to explore these things in a more traditional or educational realms.
True.
That said, many of the New Age and Wiccan practices involving these things are, for better or for worse, detached from the actual lineage of ancient knowledge, despite what most of what might be said, and that in both cases, much, though not all, of Wicca is very modern, was
Mhm.
developed in the 20th century, and is certainly a read on, in many cases, Celtic paganism, as well as other typically European, although not limited to European, mm, in some cases pre-Christian practices, or in other cases folk magic lore that was in opposition with the authoritarian aspects of the more overarching church. So there is an element of reactionism as a result of that. There is also the aspect that it has to be recognized as a newer religion than it appears or it feels like, just based on its historical reality.
Yeah, I agree with you there. Before I forget, I was going to mention and see your thoughts. The significance of the convex mirror.
Hmm. Besides conveniently spotting that 18-wheeler creeping up on my
Yeah.
on my left bumper. Um,
I,
I think
I do
I think
find it interesting that they're associated with demons and driving.
and well, that's fair. That is very, very fair. Of course,
Driving around town today, that's for sure. Sorry.
no, I largely right there with you. Uh, I think it's interesting, to say the least. I am personally fascinated. The the thing that really stood out to me about many of these aspects with mirrors, and again, I'm gonna resort to a dichotomy. On one hand, something that we see is a mystical obsession with mirrors in an era when mirrors were not common.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's has to be taken into account at a time when certainly in we'll just take the Renaissance period, at a point when the technology had developed in order that a very effective mirrors could be created.
Mm-hmm.
Mirrors that were concave, mirrors that were convex, mirrors that were flat could be created and were almost de facto put into use in varying ways associated with the esoteric arts, associated with conjuring, associated with divination, associated with reaching into portals of other realms, comes into play. And certainly the everyday people who were far removed from this technology couldn't help but look at this stuff in very differently than we would look at it today.
True.
And so it is automatically easy to simply relegate the esoteric art aspect or the magical quality to primitive superstitious people, so on and so forth. I also think that that would be a mistake because we seem to consistently see odd and interesting things archetypally and then also in actuality happening around these mirrors through the ages. So I think, again, the answer is both. But as to the demons with concave or convex mirrors, I'm a bit of a loss, but I do like to have one on my my side panel on the truck.
I'm right there with you on that one. Now, what you just said pretty well kind of leads into, we kind of have to talk about Bloody Mary a little bit.
I love Bloody Mary. She's spooky.
And the antecedents to the Bloody Mary game actually go back a very long ways.
They do. So, as the current iteration of Bloody Mary almost exists really just an urban legend as teenagers trying to spook each other out on sleepovers.
Right.
That's really the construct that we have for Bloody Mary, and the bits and pieces of the lore tend to vary. But for people who are not familiar, basically you say Bloody Mary 3 times while looking into a mirror, and she appears over your shoulder, but only in the mirror.
Mm-hmm.
And
then she answer questions.
Yeah, so basically it's a bit like summoning a genie with a mirror and albeit unhappy dead spirit / demonic / poltergeist aspect that you're conjuring, and then you're harnessing what you've conjured,
which tends to not engender affection from.
No, it's the idea that and certainly there is an unspoken implication in the story, which is if you're in theory that there was someone long ago who was very good at conjuring and harnessing, and so that if you were skilled in the art, you could do this sort of thing safely. But chances are, if you're a 14-year-old kid in your suburban parents' bathroom, the likelihood that you have the requisite skill is unlikely. So you're taking a grave risk.
And said 14-year-old girls, these iterations of what became Bloody Mary go back hundreds of years and tend to revolve around young girls trying to figure out who they're going to marry.
Yes, which is a consistent theme in divination.
It is, and it is also what they believe started the Salem witch trials, basically.
Yeah.
Screwing into a bowl of water with broken eggs, which really is the surface of the water is again using a mirror.
Yeah, it is.
So,
And if I just realized if they did it wrong back in Salem, they might have accidentally conjured Bloody Mary, and she just wreaked havoc and initiated the witch trials.
that's not an official theory.
No, it is not. I am very facetious. Very, very facetious.
But
Just popped into my head.
could certainly be a cautionary tale about doing this.
Well, it also speaks to the fact that in order to be a witch hunter, you have to be a pretty good witch yourself.
Although they would never admit it.
No, absolutely not. I mean, here in the Ozarks, it's called being a power doctor.
That's right.
Because you don't even use the term witch.
And that being said, another use of the mirrors is that part of the lore is that a mirror will turn dark in the presence of an evil witch or an evil spirit.
Mm-hmm. That is, so it's like a compass.
I guess. So again, duality, either the mirror is going to go dark and you don't see anything, or you see the evil spirit through the mirror and you have to worry about it escaping. One or the other.
Could be either. So obviously there's the scrying aspect and the long-standing divination for one's future partner.
Mm-hmm.
But that is typically the impetus behind a dumb supper. That is the impetus for apple divination, Halloween, and the use of apples in Halloween ceremony, and traditions like bobbing for apples. Now, coming back to Bloody Mary, I largely know Bloody Mary as simply the urban legend, and also from one episode on Supernatural, which I really like. But the idea of a ghost, tormented soul existing within the mirror, waiting unhappily to answer your questions, don't let her off the leash. This is getting to some pretty dark territory.
Well, I mean, you're one step away from Beetlejuice, Don't say his name 3 times.
Yeah.
And you don't have to use a mirror either.
Right.
Which I'm sure, my guess is that Bloody Mary is the sort of the inspiration for that. But
that's fair. To me, it is fascinating, and it's it goes into a pretty large pantheon of omens, spirits, dangerous fae that are traditionally female.
Yeah, true. Although there are the fair share that are male as well. But
That's true. That's true. Is there a lot of tradition of adolescent boys doing Bloody Mary, or is it mostly girls?
Mostly girls, I think.
Hmm. Obviously, I've never done it, but that just seemed like a bad idea.
I just always thought it was stupid myself. I'm just being
Oh,
candid.
yeah, I think that's fair. I think that's very fair. I was just in terms of the mm, reaching into the other realm, and I was contemplating the banshee, um and and also the fates,
Yeah.
the traditional, both the Greek and the Norse traditions of the fates, that they're reminders to me of these things.
Yeah.
And the Kalach, the winter, the Scottish Kalach, that all of these things just remind me a little bit of tying in, divination, death, omen, and even though we're dealing with mirror spirits, there is an aspect of it that reminds me of the Fae, and the idea that you're interacting with the other, you're interacting with the other world, and it could really go badly.
Yes. It really could. And then as a bit of a curveball, and I threw in, discussed her before we started all this, while we were researching, the idea of natural holograms.
That one is very odd. Um,
Um, but really, what fascinated me about this concept, and basically, it's developing theory in media theory and psychology that um, basically is giving more, quote, a modern um, language to the idea of thought form, really.
mhm. So essentially a tulpa.
Yes. Um, but it goes a step further that there's manifestations that are reflections of the living world, not necessarily the dead, but of, and not even necessarily of living beings like doppelgangers, but that our interaction with reality creates a two-dimensional, or actually three-dimensional image out of our subconscious,
Well, and
so
and
that apparitions or whatever we're seeing could actually be from our own subconscious, a little bit of what you were discussing with yoga. Um,
mhm.
and so it's a little bit of a twist. And the idea that what we think of holograms, and like, the image of Princess Leia and Star Wars as a
Yeah.
hologram, or the one in the new Blade Runner movie. Um, it's all done with focused light and so forth. But theoretically, they're experimenting with the idea that this could happen and it's seen, but without a focus of light, which to me is no different than when people see an apparition.
I think that's very true, and it's uh, help me, Obi-Wan Kenobi. You're my only hope. Uh,
Exactly.
for the record, I can do that entire spiel. Um,
I have
uh,
no doubt.
I know, I know. Uh, but I won't. But in case anybody, challenges me on it, I can respond. But what we're essentially talking about is an organic projection, or a naturally
Yes.
occurring projection, which to me is a fascinating concept. I think certainly in terms of my study, I haven't necessarily encountered a physical or a visual projection, but I think that a number of what we classify as poltergeist activities are projections from an intense energetic projection from the subconscious. And this, to me, this gets into really, first of all, really interesting territory, but also troubling territory. Not troubling to me, because I deal with duality and weird contradictory dichotomies part of for fun. But for individuals who are really locked into a particular theory or opinion based on paranormal activity, this can be presented as a way of explaining away all sentient paranormal activity.
Right. And I'm not suggesting that
No.
by any means. But I think that, and I think the interesting aspect of this for this conversation is that basically the barrier between our mind and the outside world works exactly the same way as the surface of the mirror.
Yes. And I think that is a fascinating perspective that is well worth consideration. I think it's well worth consideration in the realm of investigation.
Mm-hmm.
And
I do too.
It's one of those areas, again, embracing the messiness of the duality, that you take this into consideration, and then also these other aspects of paranormal as well. So it could be this, it could be that, it could be something else entirely. It's
Or both.
or both. And I think that is really fascinating, because it really begins an internal and a mental dimensional shift in the way of analysis.
I think so. At least it's food for thought.
I like it.
And I think maybe now we shift to mirrors that are in the Ozarks.
Oh, which one would you like to start with?
I don't know. Do you want to start with your own experience, or save that for last?
Oh, we'll start with the Lint Mansion. We had the opportunity to visit the Lint Mansion very informally, not as an investigation. We just walked in, and the Lint Mansion is is in St. Louis. It was constructed in 1890 by the Limp family, who owned the Limp Brewery, which produced Falstaff beer. And prior to Prohibition, it was busy building St. Louis for decades.
Well, and actually was the biggest brewer. Some people said the biggest brewery in the country, certainly in St. Louis. So Anheuser-Busch, but they were Johnny come lately in the game. And a lot of their success owed to the downfall of the Limps.
Yes. And the Limp family was clearly plagued by deep tragedy.
Yes.
And the house is open to the public, both as a boutique hotel and also as a high-end restaurant, and as well as an event venue. And they also host investigations there. So it's increasingly well known for its paranormal activity.
Yes, it has gained quite a reputation the last few years.
And I would, based on my limited time at the mansion, would sign off on that. It was very interesting, and had the chance to go in there and and look around, and you can go up to the second floor. And the second floor is, of course, the main floor for the bedrooms. And the bedrooms were where many of the deaths took place. There's at the time, in mid-morning, very odd, intense push-pull energy and a heaviness, a strong heaviness. And it was also notable there were a number of mirrors, some of them very oddly shaped, one particularly long rectangular mirror that was in the second floor lane, on the wall, the second floor landing. Some equally interesting family portraits on the wall that also could be described as a bit unsettling. But overall, my two impressions for the space was simply being impressed by its extraordinary beauty, and also a sense of, especially on the second floor, feeling as though I was intruding. That,
I mean, especially considering everything that happened in the house, including the number of suicides. I can understand that.
yeah, it was a space that I was really excited about being in, just because of its historicity and for its beauty. At the same time, I kind of wanted to not be in the space in a fairly short amount of time. And then it was odd because the sense of unsettling, the unsettling sense tended to follow through the day.
Even after you left.
Even after I left, yes.
That's
And
interesting.
then, and this is we get to the mirror part, because 2 o'clock the next morning, I do think it was interesting. It was in the 2 o'clock hour, because I don't really believe in the witching hour, but I did note the time that staying in an Airbnb in St. Louis, not within close proximity to the Limp Mansion, but still within St. Louis, so you're in the same town. And my dog suddenly became incredibly agitated between 2 and 2:30 in the morning, barking at the mirror, which was, interestingly enough, placed right next to the bed. Became extremely agitated, was whining, was barking, woke me up, was bouncing around on the bed. He'd look at the mirror and then react as though he was seeing something, and was doing it very consistently. It was specifically focused on this mirror. There was another mirror in the room that was on a door, but this large standalone sort of person-sized height mirror next to the bed was the one that he was freaking out about. And this was third or fourth night that he'd been there, had been sleeping on the bed, had been in the bedroom at night, and had never acted like this prior. And very unsettling. And I'm lying there half awake, half asleep, going, "What are you doing?" And then I start thinking about two things. One, how Sky, my puppy, acts in regards to supernatural entities or paranormal entities. And two, the mirrors at the Lint Mansion and that weird sense of antagonism but allure that was existing on the second floor. And I thought about that for a little bit. And then I jumped out of bed and grabbed a quilt and threw it over the mirror.
Well, who knows? He might have kept you from losing your soul.
He might have, and that would have
By
been sad.
waking you up.
I seem to be rather attached to my soul. I'm glad I still have it.
I mean, it's definitely an interesting. I mean, it's definitely interesting and unsettling, because there doesn't seem to be a good alternate explanation for
No,
him doing that.
you know, the way I'm approaching it at this point is it is simply documented as a thing that occurred.
Hmm.
And on one hand, I am hesitant to attach too much one way or the other, but I can tell you at 2:30 in the morning, with Sky barking at the mirror, highly uncharacteristically, and after having been in the mansion earlier, my mind did put a lot of things together, perhaps accurately, perhaps inaccurately, and I don't get creeped out too much. I did find that unsettling.
I probably would too, in those circumstances. And you left it covered.
Yes, yes, I was there for another 2 days, and for the record, I was not about to take that blanket off. That was I again. I was. It felt like Gandalf with the Palantir. Um, that you just don't know who might be watching, and it was very unsettling. Did not like that, and so Saturday morning, I think it was, packed everything up, got ready to go, and very expressly packed everything else to the truck. Um, did my last checks, my last look under the bed, my last look in the closet for anything that might have rolled under there or I might have forgotten, so on and so forth. Checked the kitchen. It was a lovely Airbnb, for the record, near Old Route 66, and Ted Drew's frozen custard. But it was made sure that everything else was taken care of, ready to lock everything up, check the doors, etc. Had everything in the truck. Took Sky out, put him in the truck, walked back in, pulled the blanket off, immediately turned around and walked out of the room. We are not spending time in front of this. Whatever y'all are doing, you're gonna do it without me in the room.
Well, if nothing else, you empathize with people who've had experiences with mirrors.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that's very important. I think that this is, again, and this goes across the board with anyone who's had paranormal experiences. Um, one's personal experience is one's personal experience, and that may be very unsettling. It, as we discussed earlier, yes, in some cases you could be encountering your subconscious, and that's a reality that takes some time to work through. But in other cases, you're not, and you and I both had experiences that were very clearly outside of ourselves.
True, and that happens, and your story actually makes me think of an experience I've had, not quite as dramatic, but at a historic home in the Joplin area that we used to do investigations at. It's not open for investigations at this point because it's being used as a private home again. The John Weiss house, beautiful Victorian, and the Weiss family were sort of rags to riches situation and made a lot of money in the mining in the area. And beautiful parlor that is probably the size of my front parlor, living room, and dining room together, at least, or more.
Wow.
And a beautiful antique mirror that's contemporaneous to the house being built. It was built in about 1890. That is about 10 feet tall, maybe even 12 feet tall, and probably 6 feet wide. A very heavy wooden frame. And we would have people who, going through the room or so forth, would say that they saw a girl dancing in the mirror, and would turn, and of course no one's there. And I never saw the girl, but I have been in front of it and seen movement that seemed to be contained in the mirror. Really explain that one. And I always had the feeling when in that room, I did not want my back to that mirror.
Mm-hmm.
And I can't really explain the reason for it, because I absolutely love the mirror. It's absolutely gorgeous. But I was fine as long as my back wasn't to it.
So what do you make of that, just anecdotally, of that phenomena, or experientially?
I do think there is some sort of energy around the mirror. And I guess another aspect of this is that, particularly a silvered mirror, and this is a very large one with glass, affects current. If it's silvered, current won't pass through it. I don't know if it could be some sort of electrical phenomena around it that seems to make it a focal point. But there were two different times over the years that I saw movement in the mirror, that there was no one else around, and it wasn't me moving. First time I just chalked it up to trick of the eye. Second time it was like, wait a minute, I've seen that before. Mm-hmm. But it wasn't formed to where I could say it looked like a person moving or anything. It was the sense of moving. Yeah. The house also was known to people see movement in other areas in the house as well, catch a lot of movement. And Shadow Man, a Hat Man, actually was caught on video in the house, actually moving through down a hallway and through the room that the mirror's in, but when it was caught, it was on the opposite side of the room, but I don't know.
Wow. It's neat to contemplate. It is also, there is, as there have been with so many of the things we've talked about tonight, an aspect that is unsettling.
Yes, and I'm not particularly superstitious about mirrors, even with any of the lore or anything, but that is the one mirror that at times I was unsettled by, even though I absolutely love it because it's gorgeous, but I can't explain that one. Then of course there's the well, before we get to sort of the more famous buildings, one other I want to discuss is actually a location that we do investigations at and events at. Yes. The George Hall House. And for full disclosure, this did not happen while I was there or anything, but the owner told me about it. And happened a few months ago. She and some friends were there, and a couple of her friends decided to do an EVP session. And as you know, it is full of antiques. And the owner's done a wonderful job curating.
Yes.
Things. And she's got a mirror in the parlor and in fact, she said, I don't know anything about it. She bought it at an antique store. She has no idea. She says, I'm not even sure that it's really that old. My guess, it's probably from the 40s or 50s. So it's not like it's, 150 years old, that kind of thing. But she said they were sitting there, and while they're doing this, she was kind of almost spacing off, getting bored. And she's watching, she's seeing opposite the mirror, and she notices that the mirror started turning black
Very
and
odd.
stopped reflecting. And she took pictures and sent them to me, and you see the progression. And then she sends me one that she's like an hour later, after they're gone, everything, she goes back in and sits in the same position, and it's reflecting fine. Not even that it was discolored or anything, that the entire surface looked tarnished black.
And there is lore associated with that.
There is. It's the lore tends to say that would indicate the presence of either an evil witch or a malevolent spirit or something, which certainly have not encountered there, but certainly can't explain it either. I mean, certainly some things happen there that are hard to explain, including a vacuum cleaner running that's not plugged in.
Yes, like that's
which
not
is on video.
Yeah. Very, very unsettling. I mean, the house is haunted. That's
yes.
And certainly some of our experiences. I know we went in, you, I, and Noah.
Mm-hmm.
We went in and it pushed back on Noah pretty hard.
Yeah,
And
it did.
that was Noah's one of those blessed or unfortunate souls that highly active locations tend to push back on him pretty hard at the moment.
Mm-hmm. And that may change over time too.
Yeah, but that's not uncommon with adolescents.
No, it's not. It does tend to happen more to adolescents. So, yeah, definitely there's activity there, and some that makes sense and some that's a little harder to explain, like the vacuum cleaner in the mirror. I can't really explain either one of those rationally. So,
and I just realized, yeah, that those are interesting combinations, of course, and Noah having an interesting experience at the ball house, which was not dissimilar to his experience at the Kendrick house.
that's true. That's true. I forgot about that.
Mm-hmm. Basically a splitting headache that would end the second he stepped out of the building.
Mm-hmm. And in candidness, I tend to at times have a physical reaction in a location that seems to correlate with how someone passed.
Yes.
The sense of not being able to breathe with someone that had a breathing problem, or pain in an area correlating to an injury, etc. So physical reactions do happen.
They do, and they do. That's occupational hazard of our work.
It is. It is. Now then, we of course, there's a lot of buzz with the Crescent Hotel being, as one of the most haunted places in America. It certainly has. It has benefited from paranormal television and documentaries over the last 20 years with its reputation. But it does, and founded, well founded, but it has its own mirror story.
And that one I'm less familiar with. I'm familiar with a number of the hauntings associated with the Crescents.
Yeah, I mean, I've not experienced it or anything, but the story goes is that the image of a woman is seen in the lobby mirror.
Interesting. I'm still fascinated by the bat owl. I was too busy looking at the bat owls to pay attention to the mirror in the lobby. But
Yeah.
I love the Crescent Hotel. It was built in 1886. It has had an extremely varied history. Certainly as a Victorian and Edwardian era hotel, as a girls' school, as a pseudo hospital for cancer patients to go to die, typically locked away in the servants' quarters, screaming in agony for a short period of time in the late 1930s, early 1940s, before the owner was carted off to the penitentiary for mail fraud because they couldn't get him on anything else. It is a fascinating place. One of the most malevolent experiences that I ever had was at the Crescent Hotel, and it was because it was me, and it freaked me out for about a year and a half. And then since then, I've been back more than a dozen times trying to replicate it to see what would happen, and it's been very peaceful since then.
But and in part, you weren't expecting it, and as I recall, you weren't very familiar with the haunted lore of the building at that time.
Not at all. I had no knowledge of the haunted aspects, and this was 2008. So it was, and I wasn't paying any attention to ghost shows. So no, I had no clue. But I do know that somebody was standing directly over my left shoulder on the skybar balcony, and that person was not happy with my presence.
That it happens. It happens sometimes.
Most of the time, ghosts seem to like me okay, or are just extraordinarily ambivalent to my presence, which I'm fine with. But in the same sense, coming back to the reference to horses, if I'm standing in a barn full of horses, or I'm standing in a corral full of horses, I want them to be ambiguous to my presence.
And I approach most things of the paranormal and the normal that way. So
yes, and and who knows? There's a wide variety of reasons that whomever or whatever it was on the balcony hated my guts, but something about me he didn't like.
But you didn't see anything in the mirror.
Did not see anything in the mirror. Did not see anything over my left shoulder, and trust me, I looked. But whatever was there was so absolutely terrifying that I was scared to get into the elevator and instead ran down the stairs.
You mean you ran?
I hurried.
Okay.
Promptly.
You power walked. Huh?
I power walked down the stairs. And my heart rate was very elevated before I even got to the stairs part.
That's fair.
Whatever it was, I am confident in saying it was not my subconscious. And I'm also confident in saying that it initiated a fight or flight response.
And that does happen occasionally, not often. I mean, or at least not often for me. But it can happen. And then another example of haunted or magical mirror in the Ozarks is at one of our favorite locations, the Coleman Theater in Miami, Oklahoma.
Yes, Coleman Theater, absolutely gorgeous location. Highly recommend you check it out. It's a Route 66 stop, and built 1929, and fascinating. Fascinating structure. Lots of history of the location before 1929 as well. Some of the hauntings are associated with that. I'm still taken by the Spanish colonial revival exterior and the Versailles inspired interior. Thank you, Mr. Coleman.
Yes. Yes, George Coleman made a statement and did so exceedingly well.
Yes, he did.
I will recall the first time that our producer Alex was in there. He actually stopped and said, I've never been in a building like this since I was at Versailles. And I said, well, that's not a coincidence.
It's extraordinary. And if memory serves, the mirror lore that's associated with the Coleman is in the green room.
Yes,
Literally.
in the green room.
Yeah.
If you recall, when you're in the green room, the area that is closest to what used to be the orchestra pit, if you're standing there and facing the opposite wall, there's a gold gilt framed mirror on the wall, and very, very nice mirror, very attractive. Not huge. I'd say maybe 3 feet by 2, roughly, maybe slightly larger. And a number of people over the years, I've not had any experience with the mirror, but a number of people over the years have had the experience of looking into the mirror and seeing the reflection of a ballerina.
Yes.
And then turn around and no one's there.
Right. Which is very interesting. There's a lot of activity that is associated with the green room, and it is in the basement underneath the stage.
Mm-hmm.
You have every reason to be unsettled or a little creeped out by the space, for the record. And granted, I've been there with, in groups. I haven't been down there by myself to just hang out.
Mm-hmm.
For me personally, it has not been unsettling.
It really has. There's been, I think, one time over the years that I've been in there that it kind of had a heavy feeling, but nothing extraordinary for my experience. And again, I haven't seen the ballerina. Every time I go down there, I hope I do, but I haven't. Actually, I'm more fascinated by the mirrors in the lobby myself.
True. And
Very large mirrors.
Yeah.
And not necessarily haunted, but then you add to that actually pretty much opposite one of the large mirrors in the lobby is the portrait of George Coleman, who built the theater, and it's under glass. It's a photo, and his eyes follow you.
Yeah.
And of course, you've got the glass over the photo, which
is a mirror. Yeah.
And it is a little unsettling how that photo follows you.
And of course, one of the notable spirits haunting the Coleman Theater is George Coleman.
Yes. And I do believe I have heard him. So
agreed.
Complaining about the phone ringing.
There is a trail of energy in that lobby space.
There is, and to be honest, I've seen shadow men through there multiple times, including in the lobby area, as well as coming down the stairs from the mezzanine. And then there's been various people who have said they were pushed on those stairs.
it's to me, it just is, based on my experiences with the space. The green room basement feels very ordinary. It does not feel like space that is out of space.
No, it doesn't.
But the lobby does.
It does. And everywhere where there's you have either, people have been pushed on the stairs where shadow men are seeing George Coleman's portrait, are all spots that are reflected from the
Yes.
mirrors.
Yes, they are. There's a lot of energy movement throughout that space. It's not necessarily negative,
No.
but there is definitely movement, and I find that really interesting. Actually, one of the photos of us for Dark Ozarks is taken on the second floor of the lobby.
That's true. That's true. You see any of our social media, a lot, it's used quite a bit for advertising the show and so forth. So, and actually, I think there was a mirror either to our side, I believe. There's mirrors all over that lobby of Mezzanine.
Yeah, and appropriately so. It's based on Versailles, but
Yeah.
it's very fascinating, and I love the space.
I do. And I definitely will risk the mirrors again to go back. So.
Oh, me too. Well, either for an investigation or presentation, or just go to see something that's playing at the Coleman.
Exactly. And definitely recommend checking it out. And they give daily tours, and not even scheduled. If you just go in, they will take you through all 4 stories. So
Yeah. Yes.
it's definitely worth it. That might be a good place to end. But we want to remind everyone not to forget to check out upcoming events and merchandise at darkozarks.com and paranormalsciencelab.com. Thank you again to Always Buying Books and Beard Engine Brewing Company for helping to bring the Dark Ozarks to everyone.
And on the next episode, we're going to be discussing beasts and monsters. Catch the Dark Ozarks podcast on Branson Podcast Network, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, Google Podcasts, Substack, or about any other podcast platform. Thank you, everyone. And remember, there are no easy answers in the Dark Ozarks.